The station was loud in the way that every place with too many species always seemed to be. Machines humming somewhere deep in the walls, voices clicking and buzzing and whistling through recycled air that smelled like engine fuel, and alien cooking, and old arguments that had never been properly finished. Vareth 9 was not a beautiful place. It was big and gray and practical, but it was one of the most important interstellar hubs in the known coalition, which was why Corporal Elena Vasquez had been sent there 3 weeks ago with a bag, a diplomatic badge, and a list of instructions so long she had stopped reading it somewhere around page 40. Elena was a human, which meant she was one of maybe 30 humans on a station that held close to 9,000 beings from dozens of different species. She was not the tallest creature there, not the strongest, not the most impressive by any measure that the coalition used to measure such things. Brown-skinned, with short dark hair, and a habit of looking at everything around her with the kind of open and direct curiosity that made most non-human species deeply uncomfortable. In the 3 weeks since she had arrived, she had learned several things about Vareth 9. She had learned that the Velnari liked their corridor temperature set at exactly 19 degrees, or they became loud and difficult. And she had learned that the Solonai delegation would agree to almost any meeting, as long as the agenda was submitted in writing at least 4 days in advance. She had learned that the best food on the station came from a small vendor on level 6, who had somehow figured out how to make something that tasted almost like rice. And she had learned that Bay 7, a large and otherwise perfectly useful docking bay on the station's east side, was completely empty every single afternoon. Not because it was broken, not because it was being repaired, but because of who was in. His name was Gral Veth. Elena had first heard that name from her commanding officer, Commander Harish Okafor, on her second day at the station. Okafor had said it the way people say the name of a storm that is already on its way. Quietly, with respect, and with the clear hope that it would simply pass without stopping. Gral Veth was a Drakthari, which was already enough to make most species nervous. The Drakthari were a warrior people, massive and ancient, and responsible for some of the most devastating military campaigns in Coalition history. But Gral Veth was not just any Drakthari. He was close to 4 meters tall. Elena had measured him against the doorframe the first time she had seen him from a distance, and his entire body was covered in plates of chitin so dark they seemed to absorb the light around them, rather than reflect it. He had 4 arms, each one thick and powerful, ending in hands with fingers like black iron, burned a deep, steady red that did not blink the way human eyes blinked, but rather dimmed and brightened slowly, like something thinking very old and very heavy thoughts. Every species on the station had a file on him. Elena had read hers. It used words like decorated, dangerous, do not approach, and veteran of the Ketsur campaigns. And every being who had read that file had come to the very reasonable conclusion that the best thing to do around Gral Veth was nothing at all. Corridors emptied when he walked through them. Meal halls cleared within minutes of his arrival. Even the station's security drones, which were not capable of fear in any technical sense, had been quietly reprogrammed to give him a wider path than regulation required. Elena had read the file too. She had read it twice. And then, on her 4th afternoon on the station, she had walked past Bay 7 and seen through the half-open door that Gral Veth was sitting on the floor. Not standing, sitting, cross-legged on the cold metal floor of Bay 7, completely alone, surrounded by tiny scattered pieces of a broken mechanical toy, the kind sold at the curiosity vendors near the station's lower rings. The kind that, when working correctly, would move its small limbs in a little dance and make children of most species laugh. But it was broken, and the pieces were spread around him, and his 4 enormous hands were hovering over them with an expression that Elena, despite having no experience reading Drakthari faces, recognized without any difficulty at all. He was frustrated, not angry, not dangerous, just frustrated. The way anyone is when they want to fix something, and their hands are simply the wrong size for the job. Elena stood in that doorway for exactly 10 seconds. She thought about the file. She thought about the words dangerous and do not approach. She thought about the look on Commander Okafor's face whenever Gralveth's name came up in conversation. Then she walked in. The entire room changed the moment she crossed the threshold. The air felt different, tighter, like the space itself was paying attention. Gralveth looked up from the broken toy, and his red eyes found her immediately, and the full weight of 2 centuries of combat history landed on her like something physical. Elena sat down on the floor next to him. Not across from him, next to him, close enough to see the tiny gear he had been trying to fit back into the toy's chest cavity. Close enough that one movement of his nearest arm could have ended the conversation very permanently. She picked up a small flat tool from the floor near his knee, studied the broken toy for a moment, found the gear, and very carefully pressed it into place. It clicked. The toy's chest plate sealed shut. For a long moment, Gralveth did not move. He looked at the toy, then he looked at her. And Elena looked back at him, the way she looked at most things in her life, which was with steady, genuine curiosity, and no visible sign of the fear that was, in fact, running very fast somewhere underneath her calm expression. "I saw you were having trouble," she said. Her voice was even and her words were simple, because the station's translation systems worked best with simple words. "I am good with small parts." He said nothing. She had not expected him to. She had read enough about the Drekthari to know that they did not speak easily to strangers, and by every definition that existed, she was a stranger. So she set the tool down, stood up, and brushed the dust from her uniform. "I am Elena," she said. "I work on level 4. I will be here for a long time." She walked out of Bay 7 without looking back. Not because she was not curious, but because she understood, in the way that humans sometimes understand things without being taught them. Some creatures need to be given the room to decide what they think about something without being watched while they do it. Behind her, in the quiet of Bay 7, a very large and very old warrior sat alone on the floor and looked at the small fixed toy in his hands for a very long time. The reactions to this news ranged from disbelief to alarm, to a kind of horrified fascination. The Velnari discussed it in tight buzzing clusters near the water dispensers. The Freth Collective sent a formal inquiry to the station administrator, asking whether the human was mentally stable, and 3 different species filed informal reports suggesting that Elena Vasquez be evaluated by the station's medical team before she did anything else that could be considered unpredictable. Commander Okafor called her into his office before breakfast. He was a tall, careful man who had spent 20 years learning how to remain calm in situations that did not deserve calm. And he sat behind his desk with his hands folded and looked at Elena the way a person looks at something they cannot decide whether to admire or be exasperated by. "You went into Base 7, he said. "I did," Elena said. "You sat next to him." "I did." "Elena," Okafor exhaled slowly. "Gralveth is not a stray animal that needs company. He is a decorated veteran of the Kethsur extermination campaigns. He has a confirmed history of military action across 6 star systems. The Coalition keeps him at a distance, not out of rudeness, but out of very well-documented practical wisdom." Elena nodded like she was listening, which she was. She was just also thinking about something else at the same time. "I understand," she said. "Good," Okafor said. "Then we are done here." "He was trying to fix a toy," Elena said. Okafor looked at her. "A small mechanical one, the kind from the vendors on level 6. His hands are too big for the small parts. He was just sitting there, alone, trying to fix it." She paused. "So I fixed it." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "Elena," he said again, more carefully this time, "I am asking you, as your commanding officer, to use good judgment here." "I always use good judgment," she said. She said it in a way that was completely sincere and also completely confident, which was somehow the most unsettling version of that sentence Okafor had ever heard. She left his office and went to the station's small fabrication workshop on level 3, where she spent the better part of her off hours that evening, doing something that the workshop's automated log would later record as non-standard container construction, single unit, oversized dimensions, heat retention model. She was making a thermos. Not for herself, she already had one, but a thermos that was the right size for hands that were not human hands. A thermos with a grip wide enough for fingers like black iron, and a lid that did not require fine motor control to open, because some hands were built for war and not for small things. She filled it the next morning with the strongest coffee the station's kitchen could produce, carried it under one arm alongside her own smaller cup, and walked to Bay 7 at the start of the 14th hour. Graal Veth was there. He was sitting in the same place, though the toy was gone. He was simply sitting, very still, the way old things sometimes sit, like they are not resting, but rather occupying space, with a kind of permanent and immovable patience. He watched Elena cross the room. She sat down in the same spot she had sat the day before, next to him, not across, and she set the large thermos on the floor between them. "It is coffee," she said. "Humans drink it in the morning. It is bitter and it helps you think. I did not know if Drakthari can drink it safely, so you do not have to, but I made it for you anyway." He looked at the thermos for a long moment, then he reached out one hand and picked it up, and he turned it over slowly, studying it the way a person studies something they were not expecting. He opened it. The smell rose between them, dark and warm and very strong. "Drink it." Not then, but he did not put it down either. Elena sipped from her own cup and looked out at the docking bay's wide viewport, where the red light of the dying star they orbited painted everything a quiet and permanent rust color. "Where I come from," she said, "when someone is new somewhere and does not know anyone, you bring them something warm to drink. It is just what people do." Graal Veth said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice that was low and very deep, and seemed to come from somewhere much further down than a chest that size should allow, he spoke. "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement a person makes when they are not sure whether what they are describing is good or very strange. Elena thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. "I was a little afraid," she said, "when I first walked in yesterday, but you were trying to fix a toy, and you looked frustrated. And it is very hard to be afraid of someone who is frustrated by a small toy." Another silence, longer this time. "That is a very small reason to not be afraid of me," Graal Veth said. "Most reasons start small," Elena said. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, each time with coffee, each time sitting in the same spot, each time talking in the easy and unhurried way that humans talk when they are not trying to get anything from anyone. She told him about Earth, about how it was a wet and noisy planet covered in a truly unreasonable number of different animals, about how humans had spent most of their history fighting each other before they finally got tired of it, about the ocean, which she missed in a way she could not fully explain, but tried to anyway. She told him bad jokes, the kind that are funny not because they are clever, but because they are so bad that the badness of them becomes the whole point. And he did not laugh, because the Drakthari did not laugh the way humans laughed, but something in his expression shifted on the third joke, in a way that Elena chose to count as progress. He began to respond, slowly, a few words at first, then longer, and Elena, who had learned patience the hard way on a very loud and crowded planet, never pushed him further than he was willing to go. On the station above them and around them, the other species watched and whispered and could not understand what they were seeing. A giant, feared ancient warrior and a small human, sitting together in Bay 7 every afternoon, drinking coffee in the red light of a dying star. 3 weeks passed, the way time passes on stations with no day or night, in shifts and meals and the slow rhythm of work, punctuated by the occasional distant alarm that turned out to be nothing serious. Elena kept going to Bay 7 every afternoon at the 14th hour. Gralveth was always there when she arrived, which she had started to think of as a good sign, though she was careful not to say so out loud, because she had learned by now that Gralveth did not like things to be pointed out before he was ready to admit them himself. They had developed something by that point, not yet a friendship in the full human sense of the word, but a shape that friendship could grow into, a space between two beings where words were allowed and silence was also allowed, and neither one felt like a problem. He had started asking her questions, careful, precise questions that arrived without warning in the middle of other conversations. Questions always do. He asked her once why humans talked so much, not as an insult, but with real curiosity, as if the habit genuinely puzzled him. She told him that talking was how humans process things, that they worked things out by saying them to other people, and that for many humans, silence felt like something had gone wrong. He considered that for a long time. Among my people, he said, silence is respect. To speak freely to someone is something that is earned over many years. Among my people, Elena said, talking freely to someone is how you start the process of earning it. He seemed to find that both inefficient and interesting. But the real shift, the moment that changed the weight of what they were building in Bay 7, came on a quiet afternoon in the 5th week, when Elena asked him a question that no one else had ever asked him. She had not planned to ask it. It came out the way honest questions sometimes do. Warning. Because the moment was right, and she was the kind of person who asked things when the moment was right, rather than waiting for a safer time that might never come. Do you regret it? She said. Graalveth went still, in the way that only very large and very controlled beings go still, completely, without even the small unconscious movements that most living things make, without noticing. Regret what? He said, and it was not quite a question, because he already knew. The HFY War, Elena said. She said it plainly, not gently, but not cruelly either. The campaigns, the things in your file. I am not asking to judge you. I am asking because I want to know what you actually think about it. The silence that followed was the longest silence that had ever existed in Bay 7, and Bay 7 had seen a great many silences. When Graalveth finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, and slower, and it carried a weight in it that Elena felt, in her chest, even though she could not name exactly what the weight was. He told her about the HFY War. He did not tell it the way a warrior tells a battle story. He did not use the words of pride or glory that soldiers of most species use to make hard things easier to carry. He told it the way a person tells something they have been holding alone for a very long time, and have finally found someone they trust enough to set it down in front of. The Mirath had been a small species, not weak but small, and not powerful in military terms, and the Drakthari had decided, in the language of that century, that small and not powerful meant inferior, and inferior meant the Mirath's worlds could be taken, and that taking them was not wrong, but simply the natural order of things made physical. Graalveth had believed that, when he was young. He had believed it the way young soldiers believe things, which is completely and without question, because believing completely and without question is what makes young soldiers useful. He had fought in 11 campaigns. He had watched the Mirath cities burn from orbit. He had followed orders without hesitation, because hesitation, in those days, in that army, in that version of himself, was not something that was permitted. And then, over years, over decades, over the long and grinding accumulation of things seen and things done and things that could not be undone, the belief had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, the way a stone changes underwater, and he had been left with everything he had done and no belief left to justify it. Elena listened to all of it, without speaking, without moving, without the small sounds that humans make when they are uncomfortable and want the other person to know it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I tell you something about where I come from?" He said yes. About Earth's history, not the version that Earth's diplomatic files presented to other species, which was cleaned up and carefully arranged, but the real version, the one with empire and slavery and wars fought over land and color and belief, the one with her own family's history in it, ancestors who had been on the wrong side of someone else's idea of the natural order. She told him that her own blood carried the memory of people who had been treated as inferior. And she also told him, because it was true and because she was not going to be dishonest to make him feel better, that humans were still fighting versions of those same arguments, still making versions of those same mistakes, still learning things they should have understood centuries ago. "I am not forgiving you," she said, clearly, so there was no confusion. "That is not mine to give. What happened to the Mirath is not something I can make lighter for you." Gralveth looked at her. "You telling me this," he said. "Because," Elena said, "I want you to know that carrying guilt is not the same as being broken, and changing is not something only weak species do. It is actually the hardest thing any living thing can manage." She picked up her coffee cup. "And because I think you have been sitting with this alone for a very long time, and that is not good for anyone, no matter how large they are." Gralveth did not respond to that right away. He looked out at the viewport, at the red star, at the long and quiet dark beyond it. But later that evening, as Elena was leaving Bay 7, he said something that stopped her at the door. "You are the first being," he said, "in longer than you have been alive, who has asked me what I think rather than what I am." The Velnari separatist faction had been on the station for 2 months under the cover of a trade inspection. 3 of them, moving quietly through the lower levels, attending meetings they were not officially listed as attending, filing the kind of reports that never went into official systems. And they had their own feelings about Gralveth that had nothing to do with diplomatic discomfort. The Velnari had lost 2 colony worlds in a conflict 30 years ago, a conflict where Drakthari mercenaries had fought on the side that burned those colonies to the ground. Children had died, elders had died, an entire branch of Velnari culture had simply stopped existing because of what happened on those worlds. And the 3 operatives in the lower levels of Vareth 9 had personal connections to those losses that no amount of coalition paperwork had ever addressed. They had watched the human get closer and closer to Gralveth. They had watched the station fail to respond, fail to separate them, fail to acknowledge what it meant to let a being like Gralveth sit comfortably on a coalition station and be treated as though he were simply a very large person having coffee with a friend. And they had decided to send a message, not to Gralveth, they were not fools, but to the human, who was soft and small and had no business making a war criminal look like something worth sitting next to. They planned it carefully, and they waited for the right moment. The right moment came on a Tuesday. The station did not officially have a Tuesday, but Elena kept Earth time out of habit. And on that Tuesday, she had finished a late meeting with the Solunai delegation and was walking back to her quarters through one of the station's maintenance corridors, which she used because they were faster and quieter than the main halls. The maintenance corridor on level 2 was narrow and gray and smelled like coolant, and it was completely empty except for Elena and the 3 Velnari operatives, who stepped out of a side passage and blocked both ends of the corridor at the same time. They were not as large as humans, the Velnari. They were sleek and quick, covered in fine pale exoskeleton with compound eyes that caught the corridor's dim light. But there were 3 of them, and 1 of her, and 2 of them were carrying shock weapons that could drop a human being before they had time to form a complete thought. The lead operative spoke in clipped, precise coalition standard. "You will come with us," it said. "You will not be harmed if you do not resist. You are a message, not a target. Your cooperation will result in the Drakthari leaving this station in public disgrace, which is what should have happened before you decided to make a friend of a war criminal." Elena stood in the middle of the corridor and looked at all three of them. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Broke the lead operative's wrist. It was not a complicated move. She had learned it in her second year with the Human Defense Corps, in a training facility in what used to be called Mexico, from an instructor who believed that the most important skill any soldier could have was the ability to make a decision faster than the other person expected. And Elena had always been very good at making decisions faster than other people expected. The lead operative went down with a sound that was not pleasant. The second operative raised its shock weapon, and Elena was already moving, not away from it, but toward it, which was the move that most beings never expected, because it was the move that made the least obvious sense. And she caught the weapon arm at the joint, redirected it, and let the shock pulse discharge into the corridor wall instead of into her. The third operative hesitated, just for a moment, and a moment was all the gap that the situation required. The third operative did not get to finish its hesitation, because the wall at the far end of the corridor made a sound like a large structure deciding it was no longer interested in being a wall. And then Graalveth was standing in the corridor. He filled it, not just in the physical sense, though he filled it very thoroughly in the physical sense as well, but in the way that certain presences fill a space, by simply existing in it, with enough history and enough weight that the space reorganizes itself around them. He looked at the two operatives who were still standing. He looked at Elena. She had a bruise forming on her left forearm where the second operative had grabbed her, and she was breathing slightly faster than usual, but she was upright and unhurt, and she was looking at Graalveth with an expression that was, he noted, more annoyed than frightened. "I had it," she said. "I know," he said. "Because I was following you," he said, without any apparent embarrassment about this fact. "I have been following you since the 3rd week, not because you cannot manage yourself, but because among my people you guard what you value, and I did not want anything to happen to you before I had decided how to explain that to you properly." Elena stared at him for a moment. The two remaining Valnari operatives were very still, in the specific way that beings become still when they are standing in front of something that could remove them from the situation entirely, and is currently choosing not to. Graalveth looked at the operatives with his red eyes, and the look was long and quiet, and carried in it the full accumulated record of 200 years of being the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. "I know what you have lost," he said to them. His voice was low, and it was not a threat, which somehow made it heavier than a threat would have been. "I know the colony worlds. I know the names. I am not going to pretend that what I did or what my kind did was something other than what it was, but you will not touch her." He did not move toward them. He did not raise any of his 4 arms. He simply stood there, and the corridor stood with him. And the two operatives made the very correct decision to be cooperative. Later, when station security had collected all 3, and the reports had been filed, and Commander Okafor had spent 15 silent minutes reading the incident log before looking up at Elena with an expression that had moved past exasperation into something more like reluctant wonder, Elena found Graalveth back in Bay 7. It was not announced as a punishment, because the coalition was very careful about the words it chose when it did not want to appear to be doing something it was in fact clearly doing. It was announced instead as a standard review of station safety and diplomatic protocol, which everyone on Verith 9 understood to mean that certain powerful delegations were unhappy and wanted something done about it. The Solani delegation had filed the request. The Solani were very good at filing requests in ways that looked neutral and were not. And the Valnari separatists, despite being the ones who had cornered a coalition officer in a maintenance corridor with shock weapons, had somehow also managed to position themselves as the aggrieved party in the paperwork, which was a skill that Elena found both impressive and deeply annoying. The inquiry was scheduled for the Grand Assembly Hall on Level 1, a large and formal room with tiered seating arranged so that every delegation could see every other delegation, which was designed to create a feeling of equality and mostly created a feeling of being watched from all directions simultaneously. Every major delegation on the station would be present. Graal Veth was the subject of the inquiry. He was asked to appear and give account of himself, of his history, of his presence on the station, of the incident in the corridor, and he arrived at the appointed time and stood in the center of the assembly hall floor and said nothing, because he had been standing in rooms full of beings who wanted him gone for most of his adult life, and had learned that speaking first was a way of giving them what they wanted before they had earned it. The Solonai representative spoke for a long time, in the smooth and carefully neutral tone that Solonai representatives always used, about stability and diplomatic optics, and the importance of managed relationships between species with complex historical tensions. What this meant, translated out of Solonai diplomatic language and into plain words, was that Graal Veth made their trade negotiations look complicated, and they would like him removed. The Velnari delegation spoke after that. Their representative's voice was not smooth or neutral. It was tight with something real and old and painful. And they spoke about the colony worlds, about what had been lost, about the difference between acknowledging a history and being made to watch it be repackaged as something acceptable. Elena sat in the observation section, which was not the floor, because she had not been called to appear. She sat there for 11 minutes. Then she stood up and walked to the floor. The room noticed, not loudly, but in the specific way a room full of experienced diplomats notices something unexpected, which is a sharp and collective stillness that is louder than noise would have been. And the Assembly's chair, a Freth collective representative speaking through a translation module, asked in a very measured tone what the corporal believed she was doing. "I would like to speak," Elena said. "You were not called to speak," the chair said. "I know," Elena said, "but I have something to say, and I think you should hear it. And if you decide after I am done that it was not worth hearing, I will accept that." There was a pause, a long one, and then the chair, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of the particular kind of tiredness that comes from sitting in too many rooms where everyone says only what is expected of them, said, "You may speak." Elena stood in the middle of the assembly hall floor next to Graal Veth, and she looked around the room at all the delegations looking back at her. And she spoke in simple and plain words, because she had never found complicated words to be more honest than simple ones. She said that she was not there to defend Graal Veth's past, was not able to do that, and she was not going to try. What had happened in the Kethsur campaigns had happened, and the Mirath were gone, and no speech in any assembly hall, anywhere in the coalition, could change that. She said that she was also not there to ask the Velnari to forgive anything, because forgiveness was not a thing that could be scheduled into a diplomatic agenda, and anyone who thought it could be had never had to do it. What she was there to say was something about the room itself, about all of them, together, sitting in their separate sections, watching each other from a careful and managed distance, about the way the coalition had built its relationships on a system of controlled separation, where species were kept aware of each other but not close to each other, defined by their worst moments and their most dangerous histories, kept at a distance that felt like safety, but was actually just a very sophisticated way of making sure that nothing ever had to change. "I sat down next to Graal Veth," she said, "because he was trying to fix a small broken toy, and he looked frustrated. That is the whole reason. I did not do it as a diplomatic strategy. I did not do it because I had read a file and decided he deserved rehabilitation. I did it because he was alone, and he needed help with something small." She looked around the room again. How many wars in this room, she said, could have been prevented if someone had simply been brave enough to sit down first, not to negotiate, not to manage, not to file a request in triplicate, just to sit down and be a person next to another person. No one answered, because the question was not really a question. The vote at the end of the inquiry was not unanimous. The Solani voted against, and 2 other delegations abstained. But the majority held, and Graal Veth was permitted to remain on Vareth 9. The room cleared slowly afterward, in the way rooms clear. People have heard something they are not entirely sure what to do with yet. In the quiet after everyone had gone, Graal Veth stood next to Elena in the empty assembly hall and looked down at her from his very considerable height. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "You could have remained in the observation section and let them decide." "I could have," she said. "Why did you not?" Elena thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about things she wanted to answer properly. "Because," she said, "you sat in Base 7 every afternoon for weeks, and let me talk to you, and you answered my questions honestly, even when the answers were hard. And you made sure I was safe in those corridors, even before you told me you were doing it. And that is what a friend does, and I am not the kind of person who lets a friend stand in a room full of people alone, if I have legs that work, and a voice that functions." Graal Veth was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that he said in his own language first, and then translated, because some things need to be said first in the language they belong to. In Drakthari, he said, there is a word, Vethkara. It means a life ward, a person a warrior has chosen to protect, not because they are commanded to, not because of duty, but because the warrior has decided that the world is better with that person in it, and they are willing to make sure it stays that way. He looked at her. "You are my Vethkara," he said. Elena looked up at him. She was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled, not the polite smile she used in meetings, but the real one, the one that reached her eyes. "Where I come from," she said, "we have a word for that too." "What is it?" he said. "Best friend," she said. He turned the words over in silence. "I find your language imprecise," he said, after a pause. "I know," Elena said, "but it fits." They walked out of the assembly hall together, the giant ancient warrior and the small human corporal, and the station moved around them, full of beings from dozens of different worlds, all of them learning, slowly and imperfectly, what it looked like when someone decided that bravery did not always have to be loud, did not always have to be armed, did not always have to announce itself.